Hello, this is Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and with me are my co-hosts Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey. What? Oh, man. I'm going to do a retake. I don't want to copy Sam. Hello. Greetings. That's something Sam would not say.
You two are just clones of each other, I suppose. Oops. Have I said too much? Today we are reviewing Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is the last book in our series Alternate Histories, Alternate Realities. If you want to find us online, we are on social media at Canonical Pod and on Reddit at rCanonicalPod. This book was my pick for our series. Ishiguro is one of the most critically acclaimed living writers. Born in Japan, he immigrated to England when he was young and later attended the creative writing program at the University of East Anglia. The UK actually doesn't have a lot of creative writing programs, so this is actually one of the most well-known, and it's not even that well-known outside of the UK.
Home of the Fighting Cloud Dogs, by the way.
Yeah? It's a good mascot.
Yeah. Remember the Cloud Dogs?
No? Is this common knowledge from your neck of the woods?
It's knowledge from your neck of the woods. You remember in our episode with Sebald, he was a professor at the University of East Anglia, and you mentioned that they are the Cloud Dogs.
Oh.
When you see a cloud and it looks like a dog, that's a cloud dog.
I shit out so much gold on this podcast, I can't keep track of everything I say. But yeah, okay. Fighting Cloud Dogs. Go. He's won or have been shortlisted for every major literary award, which must be nice, including the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2017. He's also been knighted, so he's actually Sir Kazuo Ishiguro. His most well-known books are The Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go. Here's a factoid. Never Let Me Go was published by Faber and Faber. Have you heard of Faber and Faber?
Yeah.
What you probably didn't know was that there never was a Faber and Faber. There was just a Faber. And he created the company Faber and someone else. And I guess he just kicked out his partner. He was like, I can't just go with Faber Publishing. I have to go with Faber and Faber. So it's him and himself. That's Faber and Faber. It's not Faber and Sons.
Waiting for you to make another clone joke.
I guess that'd be the second clone joke. That's true. That's a kind of hubris, right? Where you not only name a company after yourself, you name it after yourself twice. So Never Let Me Go, on the surface, is a simple novel. It's told retrospectively. The story starts with the main character, Kathy H., who is describing her childhood at Hailsham. It's a kind of private school that I often associate with the UK, one of those boarding schools or whatever, where children at Hailsham, they're raised by guardians who are preparing them for some unknown purpose. Two other main characters in the novel are Ruth and Tommy, Kathy's two closest friends. And over the course of the novel, the reader discovers the true purpose of these characters and discovers that the novel takes place in an alternate version of 1970s, 80s, and 90s Britain. And the only reason you'd know, I don't know if you guys caught this, but a lot of prominent reviewers did not, is on the dedications page, he tells you it's set in the late 90s. Did you guys catch that?
I don't have my copy.
I noticed it.
Yeah.
I mean, when you say that these reviewers didn't know, are they saying that they didn't know, or are they just making mistakes when they talk about it being 2005?
Yeah, in the review, one reviewer said something like, set in some unknown future.
Ah.
And another reviewer said that while the time is not disclosed, we assume that it's... So, I mean, he can't really give him too much shit, because honestly, who reads that page? No one really. I only read it because it was an ebook, so I have to go through it. Usually I just flip right through.
Yeah. Small piece of information here. A lot of people, when talking about Ishiguro, make a lot of fuss about him being Japanese, born in Japan, but he moved to England when he was 5 years old. Do you get any kind of Japanese vibe from this novel?
No, not really.
I don't, but I think it's only important in that it sets him apart from other British writers, which is what he said in interviews.
I want to say that even though I'm sure he's probably sick of people talking about it, in this novel, there is that specific haziness that I find in a lot of Japanese fiction. And it's probably not something that he's consciously trying to do. He's certainly not saying, well, I'm doing this because I'm Japanese, but it is maybe a kinship, perhaps something that he's not even aware of, something that we saw maybe in Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami. Obviously, it's not as surreal as that novel, but it's the same sort of haziness.
What do you mean when you say haziness?
I guess the entire atmosphere of the novel is full of a kind of emotion. Where in Kafka on the Shore, things were very mysterious and nostalgic. In this novel, everything is also very nostalgic and everything is very meaningful in the same way.
Hmm.
So that I think is something that is Japanese, but I don't want to say that Ishiguro in general is a Japanese or Japanese style novelist. It's just something that I noticed in this one work.
So this is kind of a callback to our very first series, contemporary Japanese fiction. Did you find that kind of, maybe instead of haziness, it's kind of like an atmospheric nature to the book? Like, did you find that in the other books that we read? Convenience Store Woman and
Not in
what was the
Convenience
other one?
Store Woman, and yeah, what was the other one?
The one we really liked.
Yep.
Oh, it was also, yeah, The Emissary by Yoko Tawada. That also had some of the same haziness. But, it's not something that all Japanese literature has, but it's common enough that I feel like it's kind of a hallmark of the country's literature.
I agree with you. There's this kind of, I think haziness is apt, but for me, it's kind of an atmospheric longing that seems to suffuse the novel because I definitely see it in The Emissary, and you see it in a lot of not just fiction, but I think also in certain anime as well.
Yeah. Actually, that's something that Ishiguro says when people ask him about Japanese fiction. He says he doesn't really care much about Japanese fiction, but he's much more influenced by Japanese film, which is perhaps something that is true, but I'm not versed enough in Japanese film to really know whether that's as true as it is with fiction.
So let's talk about spoilers now. I think what we'll do is we'll try to talk about this book without spoilers first. And at some point, we'll just say we're going to talk about spoilers. And if you care about that because you haven't read the book, just skip to the next episode or read the book. The next episode will also have spoilers. So skipping to the next one won't help you, but at least you'll have the satisfaction of knowing you're skipping some spoilers. Is there anything here that you guys would like to talk about regarding the book that is not a spoiler? Because so much of the book is a spoiler, in my opinion. So, what would you like to talk about that is not a spoiler? That first page is pretty good. It's a good start to a book.
I think one thing worth talking about is the tone of the characters and the tone of the entire novel. I would say that, especially Kathy, the way that she thinks and speaks and acts is very bland. And I used that word. I talked with some other people about this novel, and they took issue with that word bland. They said that it was probably that she was depressed and that her manner was just a result of her depression. But I just really feel like one of the biggest things that made this novel difficult to read was how uncompelling her and the other characters were.
I sort of agree, but I read it a little bit differently. I felt like there was kind of this resignation that you don't fully understand until the end, but you are getting the resignation of someone who knows their fate, but you don't understand what that fate is for most of the book.
I'm honestly at a loss. I don't know what you mean by bland. And I thought the book was not boring at all. So I really have no idea what you mean by bland.
Boring is perhaps not the right word, but it's that when you hear her speak, it's like you are talking to a middle-aged bureaucrat whose hobbies and interests are the most mainstream pedestrian sort. Like, there is nothing in her that marks her as vibrant or idiosyncratic or interesting. She's very pleasant. She's very stodgy, I think is the British word for it. Very stodgy.
Okay, so I have a response to this, but are we ready to talk spoilers then?
I will say, without spoilers, that I think I understand what he means, but while I didn't really have a problem with the tone per se, there is a blandness of sorts to most of the characters' lives. And you have to start to question that. You have to pick at that to understand what the book is actually about. Because if you just read that surface level, then it's really boring. And until you talk about those spoilers, until you talk about what else might be going on, then it really is this kind of teen drama.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think if you've read any other review of this book, everyone talks about how you can never take Ishiguro at his face value because he always plays this kind of trick where the book seems to be one thing, but it's actually not that thing.
Even with the spoilers that we're going to get to, the way it's written, those spoilers are almost like casually tossed at you. So casually that you have to decide for yourself, what is this book trying to tell me? Do you know what I mean? Like they're rolled out so gently, so deliberately that it's kind of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But it kind of belies what you're talking about, James, that there are a lot of other things happening.
I read someone who wrote about this book who said that on its surface, it seems to be like a science fiction thriller, but it really is not a science fiction thriller because while there is a plot twist, the plot twist kind of matters in that it helps resolve the plot, but it's not really what the book is about. The book is more about the experience of it and about like where it places you, the reader.
Well, let's not go too far with this. Let's save that for the next episode because we'll talk a lot about that in the next episode. Just to be clear here with my remarks, I'm not saying that this blandness makes it a bad book, but it makes it a book that is not pleasant or enjoyable to read. And I think there is a distinction, and I think that it's worth noting for a reader who hasn't picked this up yet what kind of experience he should be ready for. Should we go into spoiler territory now? I think we've been teasing it long enough.
All right. We are now going to spoil everything in the book. One of the more interesting readings of the book I found was, I believe this was in someone's PhD thesis. The thesis itself was a kind of a mess, but I thought it was really interesting how they posited one reading of this book as being the characters all over the course of their education are learning how to be human, which makes sense, right? Because they didn't have parents. And according to the law of that Britain, they're not actually people. And so it's almost like an interesting puzzle in that they're not actually legally people, but they're learning how to be human, and they do this by mimicking other people. So, for example, like when they start living in the cottages, there's that scene where Ruth copies this other couple who copies this show and how like couples are supposed to behave. I mean, this idea of copying, like echoes with this idea of cloning, which is, spoiler, what the book is about. But also like this kind of blandness where they seem to just like what other people like and they just don't have any of their own original ideas. I think that's a reflection of the same, which adds that layer of complexity to the book. But the way he writes it is he infuses it with the book. So the book has that kind of feeling, which is kind of interesting, and I didn't mind it personally.
Yeah, I think that's true in parts of the novel, but there are other parts of the novel that are more compelling because they speak to a more vibrant experience. What I'm thinking of is at the end of the novel, after the meeting with Miss Emily and Madame, when Tommy has a kind of a nervous breakdown by the side of the road. That seems to me like a more sincere and individual human experience. And also in an earlier scene, when they go to Norfolk to try to look at Ruth's possible, she has a outburst where she says, "Oh, if we're looking for our possibles, we should really be looking in the gutter, because we were copied off of the lowest people in society." Like, those were scenes of real emotion and real complexity, and they stand out as compelling and interesting because for most of the novel, they are not just uninteresting characters, but they are uniquely bland. It's like most food, even if you don't think it tastes good, has some flavor. These are uniquely bland characters because they don't have any particular flavor most of the time.
I agree with you, but I'd say that's the point. A charitable reading would be that Ishiguro is doing this on purpose to contrast this kind of lifeless human, like this bland, lifeless human, with an actual human.
They have what Miss Emily considers a good education, but you get the sense that this is not a good education compared to what we think of as a good education. They are very cut off from the world. And at least I got the sense that their education is focused on art and maybe humanities, if you want to call it that, but simplified versions of everything. I don't think it explicitly states it, but I got the sense that everything they're learning is like a fragment of what they should be learning if they were normal humans.
In a way, you could say that their education is similar to the way that the royal family is educated. They don't learn practical skills in their education. They learn things like flower arranging and calligraphy because those are the skills that are suitable for their station. They'll never become engineers, they'll never become doctors, so there's no point for them to study science. In the same way, these people don't really need to know anything about science because it's never going to matter to them.
Right. So that goes to, as James would call it, a charitable read. But I also agree with you that that does make it difficult to read.
Sorry, I'm still lost here. Like, what exactly is difficult, though? Like, do you mean difficult as in unpleasant? Like, when you read it, you just feel like, oh, I'm so bored, I don't want to read it? Or what? Because I never had that feeling.
Like I said earlier, it's an unpleasant read. It's not enjoyable to read. And you're attributing it to their upbringing, but I don't know if that's really where I would go with it, because their upbringing is distinct from ours, but I think the things that are missing from their upbringing wouldn't result in the way that they behave. That's how it feels false. Like, there is a characterization calculus. These things that have happened to them don't seem to add up to the way that they behave. And, we don't know enough about the world to know how it would exactly add up. But the result for me is it's not a novel that I enjoy reading because the characters are not interesting to me. Even if I understand that they have been written this way on purpose, it's still boring.
I wouldn't say that I was bored reading it, but I had to take a lot of pauses, I'll say, to think about what I thought was happening. Like when you're learning about these romantic issues that the characters are having, all of it feels very, it's word bland, because it feels like you're not being told something that matters. You know that there's something else, but it's being hidden from you. And what you get instead are these fairly rote characters and fairly rote interactions with little pieces of something special, but you have to wait for those things to appear. I sensed that those were there. So for me, that was part of the enjoyment, is trying to find where that rabbit hole went. But the blandness caused me to stop a lot and think about, why is this happening? Why is he writing it this way?
I'm quite surprised. I think this might be a book where we have the biggest difference in opinion, because I never felt that at all. I thought the book was really engrossing, and I kind of read it in 2 sittings. I didn't have any issues going through the book. I didn't find them boring or bland. And then upon finishing the book, I kind of went back and started reading it again. I guess I kind of understand what you mean, but it's just something that never even occurred to me. Like, I never even thought of it that way, as being bland or dull. So yeah, this sounds like the book we've had the biggest difference in opinion on.
So what about suspense? I think that plotting is a part of this novel, but perhaps not a major part of this novel, but there are reveals. Do you think that he handled that well?
For me, I really enjoyed the book, and I think maybe the only criticism I might have about the plot is the scene where you find out what the art pieces are about. It seems like a set piece,
Yeah.
but besides that, I mean, I don't have any issue. I really didn't even have an issue with that. I mean, that was a little bit theatrical with, people in the shadows and all that. But yeah, I didn't have any issues with how it was revealed over time.
What makes the book subversive, and in some ways makes it a good book, is that it subverts your expectations. You know something is up, and you know there's going to be a reveal, and there is a reveal, but by the time the reveal happens, you also know that it doesn't really matter. It's not really the important part of the novel. So it does feel perhaps a little bit deflating. I don't know how you reacted to that. You said that it was kind of a set piece, but did it feel important or meaningful when it was happening?
To answer that, I want to bring up one of the things that Kathy talks about halfway through the book, I think. When I think it's by the time they get to the cottages, somewhere around then, maybe right before or right after, she's talking about how when things are revealed to them at the school at Hailsham, they are revealed piecemeal, like in little chunks. And the way those little chunks are rolled out,
It normalizes what's going on for them.
right, it kind of makes them feel like, oh, we kind of already knew these things, but we didn't really know them. So it washes over them in no big deal, because they're given these little pieces of truth, these kernels along the way. And I feel like that, as a reader, that's what you're given here, is that you're given these little kernels, to the point that I kind of assumed I knew what the art was for, and I was more or less right. But by the time those things get revealed to you, it kind of doesn't matter, like you're saying. You already sort of know, even if maybe you didn't know the whole truth. So that by the time you do learn the whole truth, it is a little deflating.
So, for our listeners who haven't read the book but don't care about spoilers at all, you have Tommy, who was in a relationship with Ruth but then gets with Kathy, and they think that they can go and get a deferral, which would extend their life. And they find out in this meeting with the madam and Miss Emily, a former headmaster of their school, that the deferrals don't actually exist, which is the plot twist. I think it really depends on how much you care about, specifically, I think in that case, Tommy in that situation. Because if you are with Tommy as a character, then that scene is very important, because he is about to die, and he is finding out that, yes, in fact, he's going to die. Of course, you, the discerning reader, already know that he's going to die. Like, this is a book about systems where individuals cannot change the system. So you know he's going to die. But in that moment is when he knows he's going to die. And if you're with him as a character, then that scene is very moving. So for me, it's not really about the plot. I mean, characters are plot, but it's more so about Tommy. It's that real human emotion that, this is the moment he realizes, okay, there's no deferral and there's no escape from the system that's going to eat him.
Yeah, I think that's true. I just feel like it might have been better. And here I'm speculating because I haven't really worked this out yet, but because Ishiguro knows that the plot is not particularly significant, when he has a reveal that doesn't matter, might it have been better if there was no reveal at all? Because you could still have the same sort of cathartic moment with Tommy without dangling this kind of false reveal in front of the reader's face. As a writer, and here I don't say that Ishiguro is a writer who's necessarily concerned with entertaining a reader, but as a writer, you know what readers like, and you know what readers would want. If you show them a reveal that's not really a reveal, isn't that just kind of teasing them? Isn't it a kind of cruelty?
Sam, you can weigh in here. I had no issues with this at all. I think it's pretty common, and it's not something that I took issue with.
I knew that this search for deferral was not going to go anywhere. I didn't know what the truth exactly was, but everything they talked about in terms of the deferment felt like a fabrication. It felt like something that kids tell themselves. Mostly because we're readers of a lot of books. The way he kept bringing the deferment up, it felt too obvious of a thing for that to be something that exists in their world. I totally understand what you mean about the subversion. I never expected anything different, I guess.
Right. The subversion is not that they didn't have what they wanted, but rather it was presented as major new information.
Right.
But it didn't function as major new information. That's the subversion in terms of the structure of the novel. And I think that, to Ishiguro's credit, I think he's doing this on purpose. He knows the mechanics of fiction well enough that he knows what readers would think would happen, and he's playing with you by not delivering that. But I'm just wondering how much that kind of play just ends up being cruelty. Because you could have this emotional payoff that James is talking about without kind of pulling the rug out from under the reader as well.
It's funny to put it this way, but I think I'm choosing to enjoy that ride, that I'm choosing to go along with Ishiguro's style and rug pulling. But it is frustrating.
Yeah, I guess the question I'll have to ponder after we finish recording is why I enjoyed it so much. Because it seems like people seem to talk about this, and I was just like, oh yeah, I'm totally on board. I had none of these issues while reading the book. I noticed, that this is a very bland plot, but I was just like, all right, yeah, I see what he's doing. I like it, So, yeah, I don't know. So, what do you think makes this a work of literature? Because it has been lauded by critics as a work of literature. So what separates it from being a commonplace love triangle romance story?
I think what we were just talking about, how there are multiple layers of things happening. One of the things that I want to talk about in a future episode is how the structure of the novel exists in such a way that it allows you to overlay a lot of different ways of reading the novel. And I found that really fascinating, to the point that I'm still trying to wrap my head around how he did it and also what his point of doing so was.
For me, one of the more interesting questions is what the role of the reader is, or what the position of the reader is in relation to the story. Because the story uses second person and addresses the reader as you. So who is the reader in the story? The reader isn't a reader in our world. The reader is a reader in that world, in this alternate reality world, where presumably the reader knows that this person is a donor. So the reader knows all the spoilers already. Like, that this is who this person is. So that's, I think, one of the complexities that I think is interesting that made me want to go and reread the book is I just wanted to think about that question. Like, who exactly is the reader supposed to be that she is talking to? if you want to use a different word instead of reader, I guess you can say, who is she addressing this to in the mechanics of the point of view, not in terms of audience.
I think any identification of who the reader is fun to think and talk about, but it really doesn't have much to do with the quality of the novel. This kind of sleight of hand is common in fiction that takes the form of letters or memoirs, where it's addressed to somebody, and obviously whoever could read it would have to be part of the world, but we never really seriously engage with figuring out who that person is. And I don't think Ishiguro gives us any hints as to who the reader of this memoir would be, but it could be a donor. It could be another carer. It could be somebody who has neither of those roles. It could be one of the quote unquote normals. So it has different kind of valences of meaning according to who would read it in the world. But when we read it, I don't know if that matters a lot to me, aside from it being kind of a nice little chin scratcher, I guess. Like, oh yeah, somebody in this world with that kind of relationship to it could have read it.
I think the question to ask, though, is why have it at all? Because he's certainly a good enough writer to write it without having a second person address. So you're right in that in more conventional fiction, you have that, and that you is oftentimes a character in the story, or the you can be used as almost like a they. That's an experimental point of view that short story writers sometimes employ. I think Laurie Moore, if I'm remembering correctly, is someone who uses that. But specifically, the question is why have it in this story? Because you don't need to have it in the story. It can just be a first person retrospective narration. So why have the you? I think the easiest answer is the you creates a kind of pathos that draws you into the book. But I don't think that's the only reason.
I think it furthers the characterization of Kathy H. Because there are two things about Kathy that stand out to me. One is that she is very nostalgic. She likes to think about the past. But number two, she's very pragmatic. She needs an occasion to speak about the past. And these memoirs are the occasion to speak about the past. If we had, rather than a memoir, we had her just thinking, then you would have to have some other way of building a pretext for why she is extensively thinking about the past in this specific order. Um, I think that, well, it works. There were times when I thought it was a little bit, not clumsy, but a little bit heavy handed. She would say things like, oh, well, this is what I want to get to first. Or she would say something and she'd say, like, oh, well, let me get back to this point. And the novel was constantly reminding you this is somebody telling you a story, and it had those kinds of discourse markers that you have when somebody is telling you a story, which I thought was interesting, but not particularly artful.
One of the arguments I read for that specific point is that the novel is a process of assembly where, and this is why there's so much harping on memory, is because these people or clones don't actually own anything, including their bodies. They own their memories. And the whole novel is that assembly of their memories, which is coupled with the disassembly of their bodies over the course of their life, because their whole purpose is to be disassembled and used. And I think it gets to this kind of contradiction that pervades in the novel, in that Ishiguro places the reader in a very uncomfortable position, partly because when you start the book, it reads like it's our world. But over the course of the book, you find out it's not our world. And it's this kind of gradual tearing, like two pieces of Velcro, where over the course of the book, you get more and more torn out of your own world in this book to this other world where people are raised as clones and become organ farms for other people. So it's interesting. It's this kind of strange experience that he creates.
Let's maybe talk about a specific scene because I think that it's clearly a symbol, and I'm just wondering if it is more than this kind of clumsy reading that I have for it. There is a scene where Ruth and Tommy and Kathy leave the donation center and go to visit a boat that has been stranded in some marshlands. I think the obvious thing is that the boat is a representative of their kind of frustrated ambitions to have a normal life. But that feels awfully facile. So, how did you read the boat? What does the boat mean?
Why is that your reading, and why does it feel too simplistic?
Well, it's an easy reading to grasp, and I don't think that Ishiguro is a stupid writer. I think that he would always try for something with another layer of meaning. So I'm wondering if it is that, or if there is another layer of meaning to the boat beyond that.
So, when I first read the boat scene, my reaction was, huh? Like, that's weird. Why are these people so interested in the boat? Because it is not at all interesting. Like, at first I thought maybe that was the gallery or the museum or whatever on the boat. And I was like, oh, that's why they wanted to go. But no, it's just a boat. And so I think you're supposed to have that reaction. Like, why is this important to them? This kind of distance between you and the character is one of the things that I think is interesting about the book, because oftentimes you are relating to Kathy and you understand everything she, wants. She over explains, right? And when you have this moment of like, huh, I don't know why all these clones are so drawn to this boat. It's this moment where you realize, oh, they're clones. And at least that was my understanding. And that's like one layer of complexity where I feel like Ishiguro is kind of playing with you when you realize, oh, this is really important to them, but it's not important to me. I don't get it. Like I don't see why they would get this. Like, why is this resonating with them? So one reading is like, oh, well, because I'm not a clone and I don't know exactly why.
I kind of felt that way. To me, it felt like the tease of escape. That, I mean, it's a derelict boat, so they can't go anywhere. But to me, it felt like a carrot dangling in front of them. Like, if they were going to try and escape this life, this would be a good way of doing so. But they don't make that mental jump. Or at least they don't on the page.
Here's another reading of it. Is a boat useful if you can't use it as a boat? Is a clone useful if you can't use these clones as organ farms? Because that's why they were created. So that's the second reading I thought about, which is the boat reminds them of themselves, but subconsciously, because they never vocalize it. But, it's this question of like, what am I here for on this earth? And no one wants to make a ship of Theseus argument.
I was thinking about that, yeah.
Or the fact that they're stuck, like literally they cannot escape. That's your thing, Sam?
No, I mean...
Sorry, I meant your life.
Definitely.
I liked that in the process of reading it, they seem like people, but in the book, they never actually interact with any people besides their guardians and Kefers. And at the end, you see that even Miss Emily and the madam are kind of grossed out by them.
Yeah, I took that as kind of an uncanny valley kind of thing. Like, they are people, but by the terms of the law, they aren't. And the normals kind of have to look at them as these other, because if they look at them as people, then everything comes apart.
I wonder, though, how realistic that is, because I know that, these people have their own political reasons for not wanting to regard them as human beings. But if I saw a person and then somebody told me that he was a clone, I don't think I would stop regarding him as a human being. I don't know if it would disgust me in the way that these people feel disgusted by these clones. I find it interesting rhetorically, but it doesn't feel true to life.
I think I kind of understand that. I'm of two minds. Because I think you're right that this book works better on a rhetorical level than it does on a literal level. But at the same time, some of the readings that I was thinking about that we'll get to in a later episode rely pretty heavily on that fact, and that I think work very well with that rhetorical nature. For instance, I think you can see a lot of racial overtones here, like the way people of color were treated in the past and continue to be treated.
I agree with Iad in that I found that a little bit unbelievable, but I also wondered, like you, Sam, I guess I'm also of two minds, if this is because we live in a society that's more tolerant than, let's say, slavery times or Nazi Germany or apartheid or Rwanda. Like, if we lived in a society where a certain group of people is portrayed as subhuman, if we would have a similar reaction. I don't know because I didn't grow up. I don't live in that kind of society. So I don't know how true that is.
This is something that we had talked a little bit about when we read Paradise by Abdulrazak Gurna, is whether or not this kind of dehumanization is authentic or manufactured for a political purpose. In that novel, it was whether or not the Germans thought of the Africans as subhuman sincerely or just as a method to justify their brutal behavior. In this novel, I think that Ishiguro is definitely pointing to this being a manufactured thing where people feel that they are inhuman as a way to justify taking their organs.
When you say manufactured, you don't mean in the terms of the book, you mean in the logic of their world?
In the world of the book, why do people feel this way? I'm saying that they are probably encouraged to view these people as subhuman because if they were to view them as human, they would feel squeamish about killing them and stealing their organs.
The main issue I had with the book, and in some ways it's a minor issue, was at the cottages. They meet all these people who are not from Hailsham, and it's alluded to in other parts of the book when Kathy cares for people who are not from Hailsham that they're really interested in Hailsham. And you find out that it's because all the other people who are not from these kind of privileged estates, they are raised in hellholes. But the people you see at the cottages, they seem normal, well-adjusted people.
Yeah.
Like, I actually was kind of annoyed when I got to that revelation at the Miss Emily's house or whatever, and you find out that these people were likely abused. But, the people at the cottages are reading, philosophy? Just spending all their time reading and having a good old time.
You can also see why the Hailsham students would need cottages as a transition, but why do the other people need it? Like, what is the function of the cottages for them?
Yeah, I think the cottages was the most problematic part of the book, but I think it was a section of the book that he kind of shoehorned in for story reasons.
What didn't work for me, the one thing I had a problem with this book is if you poke at the logic of it too deeply, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like, you have to do a lot of suspension of disbelief. For example, technology has changed a lot over the past almost 20 years now since this was written, and has changed a lot since the world of the 80s and 90s when this is supposedly taking place. But it doesn't make much financial sense to raise a bunch of kids 20, 25 years for their organs. And now we wouldn't have to do that either. You can just grow organs. But even back then, even in the world of the 90s, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to do it this way.
Like, you should be farming them when they were teenagers. That's what you mean.
Right.
Even like 5 or 6.
Well, no, you need the kidneys to be mature. You
Right.
can't have a 6-year-old kidney as a 70-year-old man dying of kidney cancer.
Right.
I mean, Sam's point is well taken. I think that, just the logistics of organ farming don't seem to be practical on the page.
Especially when you just have, prisoners lying around.
I mean, sort of, yeah. That would be kind of an interesting book on its own, probably. But those kinds of issues, to me, that they felt so in my face that it really encouraged the suspension of disbelief. But I also was on board with the book in general, so it wasn't too hard for me to do.
I didn't have that issue once again with the book, but I did think about how this seems to be a kind of capitalist hellscape, but he just doesn't focus on it. Because really, who can afford all these organs is going to be like the rather wealthy, right?
Right.
The the National Health Service or whatever, I don't think they're like, giving everyone free hearts or whatever.
Right.
It could be a capitalist hellscape, but it could be perhaps even more damning if it's just something really commonplace and everyone is willing to do it.
That kind of goes along with the capitalist hellscape. Aren't we all willing participants of the capitalist hellscape right now?
It's a variant of a hellscape. It's hellscape 2.0, I guess. Yeah. If everyone is participating, it's a little bit different versus it's actually worse, isn't it? Like if everybody's willing to do it, then you have to do some soul searching. If it's just this, secret cabal of Bohemian Grove sort of people, then it's easier to demonize them and say, well, they're the problem.
Part of the point of the book is that there are systems in place, that you can't just subvert those systems. You can't just decide, I'm not going to go along with this.
So much so that it never even pops up as a question.
Right.
Which is one of the more interesting parts of the book, is that they never really challenge it.
Yeah, not really, but there are kernels of conditioning. I think conditioning is a big thing in this book. For example, anytime when they're young, one of them asks a question that is actually going to lead somewhere, the other kids jump on them as like, no, you don't ask that kind of thing. How crude.
Right.
But those are real questions, and they're always tamped down.
Or if they ever thought about escaping, there were the stories about people being murdered in the woods.
Right.
And the thing is, it's so real because kids are like that. Like I have 2 young kids and they're like that. Like they will reinforce certain rules, not the ones I would like them to reinforce, but they will reinforce certain rules,
Right.
among themselves.
You can see where some of these things are things that the Guardians would have taught them, but also you can see how some of this is probably just purely their imagination and their creation.
And you contrast that with the end of the book where Miss Emily says that this rule about Hailsham students being given a deferral is something that they never taught, and they always tell people that it's not true, but independently, it keeps coming back to life.
Mm.
So it's like there is a wellspring of ideas about the way the world works that's almost innate, and you don't have to teach it to people, it just comes up.
That's like The Matrix, the movie, not the mathematical idea.
Thanks for clarification.
All right, we'll stop here. Thank you for listening. If you would like to chime in and let us know how you felt about this book, you can find us on Reddit or on social media at CanonicalPod. We'll be back next week with more discussions of this novel. If you're interested in joining that discussion, go ahead and find a copy of Never Let Me Go. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.